If you paid any attention in your 10th grade American history class, you probably know the following things. Hitler and his Nazi regime took over much of Europe during World War II. The United States was brought into the war by the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. There were 16.1 million men and women in the service during this war. Most of our battles were fought for the U.S. in the Pacific Islands and in Europe. Your teacher probably did not tell you that when we joined World War II, we brought 275,000 German prisoners of war into our communities and farms as agricultural labor. Housing these prisoners in our country, the face of the enemy began to become clear for American citizens, and it certainly wasn't what we expected. Held in 511 base camps across our nation, these prisoners of war worked in the fields and farms of rural America as they worked side by side with Americans. These POW camps impacted the lives of German prisoners and American citizens as an exchange of population and work was made. This encounter of new cultures and people left valuable memories of this exchange that took place right in my backyard. With 1.9 million Americans enlisted in the military during World War II, the number of men available to work the farms and ranches was extremely low. Luckily, the German POWs were able to take their place in the fields as laborers. Therefore, a majority of the camps were placed near American farms and ranches. Idaho was an ideal location for these prisoner of war camps, with base camps in Coeur d'Alene and Rupert. By the end of the war, there were 18 detachment camps throughout Idaho, Montana, and Oregon. Camp Rupert was one of the biggest camps nationwide. The Germans arrived at Camp Rupert in 1943, ranging from young men enlisted at the age of 15 to officers in the Africa Corps. They were sent to detachment camps around the Northwest to work in the fields of local farmers. Many of these camps were placed right in my backyard in the towns of Marsing, Nampa, Emmett, Wilder, and Nissa. Even though anti-Japanese sentiment was higher here in Idaho than anti-German prejudice, people were still afraid and a little curious about these prisoners. This is what John Larson said about the experience.
You just have no idea the mentality that occurs when a nation is attacked.
The Germans had been portrayed in the media as the worst of the worst, Nazis to the core, and the locals were curious to see if this was true. The POWs may have seemed almost like a traveling exhibit that had come to Idaho. Here, Roy Herman describes his first views of the prisoners of war.
Another fellow and I, another young man and I, we were about 10 years old at the time, fetched a couple of German helmets that apparently this other kid's dad had brought home from World War I, and we were sitting there wearing those, looking at the German prisoners at a distance there.
They thought they'd arrived at the fatherland, maybe.
Maybe so. They were back home after all. But I do distinctly remember the guards getting off the prisoners got up, the guards lined them all up and marched them over here.
After arriving at these detachment camps, the POWs worked in the sugar beet fields, potato fields, and fruit orchards that are here in Idaho during the summers of 1944 and 1945. These POWs were well worth having in our fields and working on our farms. Dick Sims described their good work ethic like this.
Well, I remember the crews that would come up to the fruit ranch, and they worked in the orchards, and they seemed to be very good workers. I know that my dad, Darwin, used to talk about they were really good workers. And
after working in the fields together, curiosity drove these Idahoans to break the barrier between prisoner and citizen, and got to experience and encounter these Germans' humanity, both the good and the bad. Will Hislop of Nampa, Idaho, remembers a conversation his dad had with one of the German workers from the Nampa camp that was working on their friend's farm.
They were all young. They were just kids that had been put in the army to fight. They had no fuss against the Russians or the French or the Americans whatsoever.
As they began to focus on the prisoners as people and not as the enemy and Germans, they began to see aspects of their humanity that resonated with them.
One time I was driving the tractor, we were spraying apples, and I was daydreaming and drove the tractor into an irrigation ditch. Even though it was dry, the tractor wouldn't back out. So there were 15 POWs working in a nearby orchard. Anyhow, one of the fellows had a hold of the hitch attached to the tractor, and he had his hand under it. And when all his help quit, he had his hand under the hitch, and it mashed his hand. Anyhow, I felt badly because it was my fault that it happened. And then, of course, they pushed the tractor back out easily.
These young Germans were able to work hard, but they weren't invincible, and they could be hurt. Tom Robison of Marsing, Idaho, talks about his experiences working on the farm as a kid with the Nazi POWs and told me this story. After spending at most 2 years here on U.S. soil, the war came to an end in 1945. At this point, the government began the process of sending the prisoners home, with the last POWs leaving the United States in 1946. Some left readily and others left begrudgingly, all of them with an encounter of American society and an exchange of memories with American civilians. After returning home to a war-torn Germany, many POWs continued to stay in contact with the Americans they had encountered during their stay in the U.S. Some even came back for good. Despite being a life-changing experience for both the POWs and the American public, it's an event that is a well-kept secret of history. For being such an impactful encounter of other cultures and people, it's an atrocity that is forgotten by all but the people that were involved. Their stories of the exchange of populations and labor, and encountering the enemy in our own backyard is one that deserves to be told.